So the human condition is that we don't actively search for the truth of things. We more than often, in the service of our emotions, create a world where we feel emotionally safe. We figured out the world, here's the way things are, and we never want to question ourselves. So Maimonides says that the salvation to all of this, as it were, is koach hasichli, the rational, conceptual, intellectual capacity human beings have. And by intellectual, he doesn't mean reserved for intellectuals. Many of us think, and I among them, that sometimes intellectuals are the people who get the most things wrong. Okay? I mean, their intellectuality does not save them from severe mistakes. You know, and in a group like this, you know, I believe in a two-state solution. I would like there to be Israel and Palestine living close to each other. But I know many people, when they study the Israel-Palestine issue, the things they say are just not true, and they don't make any rational sense. These are people with PhDs in Middle Eastern studies and so forth, and I read what they say, and I realize they're never challenged. They live in an echo chamber, and if you try to challenge them, then you're called a fascist or somebody else. And I ask myself, how could people so smart and so accomplished live in a sealed world? Well, I think people need to have a nicely wrapped world. Well, there's good and evil. Israel is evil, therefore the other side is good. Therefore, everything Israel does is bad, and everything the other side is good. And that's a very, very tidy world. So even intellectuals, no matter how smart a person is not saved from this kind of thinking. I'll bring it down to, conflicts between people. Whenever a person comes to me with family conflict, I hear a story. And one of my jobs is, not to figure out in their family, in their family, let's say, often say a father and a son are having conflict, and I think the father is really wrong about something. I'm not going to find out about his childhood that is the etiology of his hostility. I just want to hear his story. I want to hear how he thinks. And when you hear how somebody thinks, you see the obvious flaws in their thinking, and you say to yourself, how could such a relatively smart and successful person operate under these kinds of illusions? Well, because their emotions set the reality, and then their mind actually simply solidifies this thing that in some ways just doesn't even exist. So the koach hasichli, when we say the intellect, we don't mean intellectual. This applies to people who are not intellectual, who live rather simple lives, for example, or maybe have very simple jobs. But they still can understand courses of action that are destructive and that are not destructive. Things to think and do that are going to actually lead to suffering and won't lead to suffering. So this does not require a great intellectual competence, but a willingness to think clearly, a willingness to use words correctly and use your thoughts correctly. Now, so when we look at the haftorah for today, just a couple of things. Yeshayahu is clearly railing against a thought. And the thought he's railing against is, since God asked for sacrifices and for ritual observance, that's all God is asking for. That seems to be a conclusion. So people said, it doesn't matter how we conduct our moral lives. It doesn't matter how we live with each other. What matters is you observe the festivals and offer the right sacrifices. So Isaiah speaks for God and says, I detest your sacrifices. I mean, astonishingly, it says, who asked you to bring sacrifices? People say, well, kind of you did, in a way. But God seems to be saying something like the following. This is the Maimonidean approach. It seems that what the Bible tried to do was localize sacrifices to the Mishkan and to Jerusalem to get everybody else out of the habit of sacrifices. When you think how many people in the entire ancient nation of Israel could offer a sacrifice, right? A tiny, tiny percent, just the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash. Everybody else could not offer a sacrifice. So the sacrificial system, you might say, was put into place to reduce people offering sacrifices. They couldn't eliminate it because that's how people thought that you propitiate God. But the direction was to limit. So these people say, well, if God wants sacrifice, the Kohen's offering sacrifice, we're showing up to the temple, we're keeping these fasts, and Isaiah will have none of it. And he says, speaking for God, I look at your Sabbaths, I look at your new moons, and I detest it. I detest you people. You raise your hands in prayer, I will not listen to one word that you say. This is strong language. because they've actually made a categorical mistake on what God wants. God does not want anything that is rote or ritual. This goes back to this dream of a common language. There is a life of inner sincerity. There's a life of willing the good that from this perspective, God can tell whether you're speaking it or not. You can say things that sound right, but there's a you might say, an attitude of the heart, whether you really are seeking justice and goodness and living right. You can lie to yourself, you can lie to others, but the inner life doesn't lie. The inner life is, you might say, is evidence. And what Isaiah is saying, God sees through all of it. Now, if you don't believe it,
Oh, say Shabbat.